Hi, welcome to Challenge JP. My name is Jacek, and today I'm going to show you how to create a project planning and costing dashboard in Microsoft Power BI.
Before we dive into the details of creating the dashboard, let me give you a very quick overview of where we're trying to get to. So what you see here is the finished report, the finished Power BI dashboard with 5 reporting pages. And the first one, overview, shows you the cost of the project that we looking into, split into labor, material, also the project revenues and the total hours that we forecast. It has the key KPI cards and also a split of the cost by labor and material and also by different phases of the project. So that's how this project is going to be set up. In addition to that, you have your material cost breakdown by different years and the resource that's going to be used or the material that's going to be used. And then finally below here, you have your staffing requirements. So you have your labor cost split by the role and also the hours requirement for each of the role on this project. If we go to the next sheet, you'll see that here we have a monthly breakdown of those resources required. That's again your staffing hours requirement by role, but split on a monthly basis. Then you have your project cash flow forecast. So as we will see in a few moments when we look at the data in detail, the project assumes there will be some milestones, and on each milestone you receive a revenue. Then there's a labor cost, so that's that labor cash flow, material cost, material cash flow, and then that gives you your total net cash flow. And also finally you have the balance, which represents the cash balance that you have at a given moment in the project. Another page is a project plan, and that's just a Gantt chart, which basically shows the project by phases. And then finally, you also have the scenario planning. So here we'll introduce Power BI parameters, and then we'll have an ability to change those parameters to see what will happen to our costs or hours requirement and also our planning under a different conditions. And then you'll see here I'll have a cost variance, so we can actually compare again on a phase-by-phase basis how much our cost will increase before and after the revision. And then finally, we'll also get back to our Gantt chart. So you saw that we have a project plan, which is the original plan, and this will be our revised project timeline, which shows the in the dark blues shows the original project plan, and then with those lighter blues, those are the extensions. Throughout this video, I will be referring to my web tutorial, and you can find a link to this tutorial in the description of the video. You will see that if I start scrolling down, you have a table of context here. So we'll start with loading the data, we'll build the data model, and then I will start introducing some DAX measures. So that's going to be quite an important part of this course. We'll build those dashboards or the reports that we look at. We look at the different ways of building them, those different pages. Eventually, we'll get to the scenario planning and sensitivity analysis. So this is where we can actually start using those parameters. You see that you can also preview this dashboard in this tutorial, and you can also download the completed dashboard template. Okay, so let's start actually with our step one here. So we want to start loading the data. What I'll do, I'll open a new blank report. You can do it by simply going to a file in the Power BI dashboard and then click on the blank report. And what we want to do, we want to start loading the data. So in order for me to load the data, I'm going to go to my Home tab here, click on the Get Data, click on the Text CSV, select Data folder, which is in the main folder when I hold my dashboard, and then you'll see I'll be using 5 data sources. Okay, let me give you a very quick overview of those data sources. So those are labor rates. Those are the rates where I hold the hourly cost per hour for my labor, material cost on a unit basis. Then I'll have payment milestones. Those are the milestones that determines when I receive my revenues. Project plan, so that's the a detailed plan with the timeline for each of the activities within those phases or the project that we're working on, and then the project resources, which basically list the number of hours on a number of quantities of material required for our project. So first, let's load them in, and then I will build a data model that will show the relationships between those data sources. Okay, so let's start with the labor rates. If I just click on that and then click on Open, you see that I have two columns here, so labor role and the average hourly rate. We can click on the transform data just to inspect those data in more detail. Okay, clicking the transform opens up the Power Query. It's very quickly inspected, so I can see that, okay, that gives me my labor role in the text format and then the hourly rate in numerical format. I could change that hourly rate already to the currency, but I'm going to actually handle all the formatting later on when we create DAX measures. But at the first inspection, we can see that that looks fine. Okay, so I can click on close and apply, and that's going to load the data in. Okay, you can see that my labor rates are here. You can always click on the table itself and then click here on my table view just to make sure that the table looks as we expected. Okay, let's go back to my report view and then again get data, another CSV file, and this time will be the material costs. Again, open. Let's again click transform data. That again opens the Power Query editor, and you see that the table is quite similar to our labor rates, but this time we have materials, our material category, and then the unit cost. Okay, so that looks fine. Material categories in text format, unit cost in numerical format. We can click on close and apply, and this will load the material cost. Again, if we click on the table view, we see that it looks exactly the same the way as we expect. And now let's click on get data again, text CSV, and then let's just go one by one. So we have a payment milestones. Okay, transform data. And then very briefly here, you see now we have three columns. So one is the name of the milestone. I simply call it M1, M2, M3, and so on and so forth. Due date, so that column has to be in the date format, which it is. And then there's a payment amount. This due date will be driving the timing of when we will receive those revenue. Let's click on close and apply. And then let's go to, again, get data, another data source, project plan. Let's click on the, again, transform data to open a Power Query editor. And then what you can see here, first of all, let's quickly checking the data types that they look fine. So the activity IDs are and phase IDs are in a text format, the activity name as well. Then you have your start date and end date in the date format, and then dependencies here. Let's click on that, close and apply again. And then we have more data to load, get data, text CSV, and then you have the project resources. Okay, and again, in a few moments, we'll start linking them together. They are now all separate, but there was a dependencies between those tables that we can use to create our dashboard. Okay, let's click open. Again, transfer data, and you can probably already start seeing that there was a link between the data that we just loaded, project plan, and this one. You see there was an activity ID in here. What this table shows is basically it shows your resource requirement. So for example, we know that in that very first activity, we'll need a plumber. We'll need 390 of that plumber. So obviously we don't need 390 plumbers. We need 390 hours of the plumber time. And the resource type is labor or material. So when it's labor, then the quantity the unit would be hours. When it's a material, it's just the quantity of the material that we need. So let's again close and apply it. Okay, so now with the data loaded, we can jump into our model view. And then what we want to start doing, we want to start actually linking them together. We want to build our data model. You can see that those two tables here, payment milestones and project plan, they have date fields. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my tutorial, and then you see in the step 1C, I have a DAX calendar. Okay, so this is where I'm actually going to start introducing already our first DAX measure, or more precisely, a DAX table. So first of all, I want to create a calendar table that will have a range of values starting from the minimum date to the maximum date based on my project plan and my payment milestones. Okay, so that's my first step here, and this is what that part of the code, of the DAX code, does. Then in addition to that, I want to extend this calendar so it can accommodate any possible delays or accelerations of the project. So you see there is a code that has a start date, which starts with my base start date taken from those payment milestones and the project plan. So I want to start with that, but then that -6 will move my the start of my calendar range 6 months earlier. And then the end date, I want to adjust the end date. So I'm adding 60 months to my base end. Okay. That way, if, for example, I want to create any delays for the project, so I want to extend this project further from the original dates, I now have a calendar that can accommodate that. Obviously, we expect that delay to be longer than 60 months. 60 months is 5 years. Then you would just adjust that code. Okay, so that's what that first part of the code does. And then in that second part here, after return, I'm also saying that, okay, I want to create several columns that I can find useful in my calculations or in my visualizations. Okay, so this is where that add columns formula comes in place. So let's just copy it, go back to our practice sheet here, and then we're still on the model view. And then I'm just going to create the new table. So click on the new table. And then when it displays table here, I'm just going to paste my calendar code. Okay. And then let's see what happens once I click on commit here. So the green tick box. You see that that created this calendar table here, and I've extended a little bit. It has all the fields that we created in our code. If you do need to adjust it, you can just click on the table and then you can change the code, and it will change actually those fields as well. Let's now start creating the data model so we can actually use this calendar table to connect our project plan and then payment milestones. So those are the tables with the dates. Let's do that. I'm going to move this material cost table here for now. I'm going to put payment milestones a little bit below, project plan as well. Payment resources also somewhere here. We'll get to those resources in a few moments. And then let's place maybe calendar here. Before I continue, there's also one important step. We have to convert this calendar table into a date table. Okay, that's an important thing because we will be using that as for our time series. So if I click on that three dots over here, you see I have an option here when I say mark as date table. Let's do that. Let's switch this on and then choose the date column, which is date. Okay, validated successfully. Okay, so we know this is our main date table. And now I can start creating the relationships between this calendar table and the project milestones and the project plan. Okay, so all I have to do is drag this date field and then drop it over related date in the payment milestones table, which is that due date. If I click OK, I want to make sure that this cardinality here is actually one to many, and then we have a single cross filtering. So let's click on save. Basically, I have to make sure that the calendar is driving the payment milestones. Okay, so when we create a visualization with the dates, let's say in our columns, those dates will come from the calendar table, and there will be filtering, or they will be driving the data from the payment milestones. Same thing with the project plan. Now, as I mentioned before, I have two dates. So I want to take the date and then I want to drop it first on the start date. Okay, and again, I want to make sure that it's actually one too many. And then I have a single cross filter direction, and then that relationship is active. And then as the second step, I want to again take the date and then drop it over an end date. Now, one thing with the Microsoft Power BI, you will see that I can't have two relationships active from from my calendar table to my project plan table. So again, after I change this cardinality to one to many and then single, uh, I want to leave that relationship, this box for make this relationship active unchecked. Okay, so if I click save, you'll see there's a dotted line between those tables. Now, if I go back to my tutorial here for reference, okay, so we've finished that calendar table. You see that that covers our first steps, and then we're getting into creating more DAX tables. Okay, so we start with the calendar table. We want to create 3 DAX dimensions that will help us with building our data model and also will help us later on with the filtering or slicing or visualizing the our data. Okay, so the first DAX dimension is face. Okay, so remember when we're looking at the project plan, we saw that it does contain the face column. So we want to create a table that will only contain a distinct faces within those tables, okay? And as you can imagine, for example, we can use that as a filter. So I'm just going to copy again this code, but basically what it does is just says, okay, well, take the face column from the project plan and then extract the distinct values from it, okay? So I'm going to copy it, go back to my practice sheet, and then click on the new table, and then I was going to paste it, the code in here. So I'm repeating the same steps as I did with the calendar table, and then you see that I have a dim face table here with just the face column. And if we go to a table view, you will see that it created a table with single column and a distinct faces based on our project. Let's go back to our model view and then create another dimension. This time it will be the activity dimension, okay? And what we want to do, we want to create the unique values with activities, again, based on our project plan. And we also want to show another column next to it that shows which phase a given activity belongs to. Copy it and then go back to our practice sheet, new table. And again, I'm going to paste it, commit, tick the box, and you see that you have the dim activity over here. I'm just going to move it. I'll clean it up in a few moments, but I'm just going to move it a little bit here above. Okay. And last but not least, if you do recall, and there was a reason why I put those two tables to the side, we have two tables: labor rates and then material costs. We want to put them into one table, okay? And this is what that dim resource will do. So by using that union function, we will create a table that combines our material costs and our labor rates together. So let's first copy it and create the table, and then we'll see exactly what that means in practice. You see that now we have table that has two columns, a resource and the resource type. And now with those DAX dimensions, we can actually complete our data model. So we want to create a relationship between dim phase and dim activity. And I want to keep this as a one-to-many single and the active. You see that activity ID is actually part of the project plan. So it's one of the columns in the project plan and then one of the columns in the project resources. Okay, so I'm going to create the relationship between the dim activity first to the project plan. Okay, so you can see that that's the relationship here. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So drop the activity ID onto activity ID in project resources. And then the last table here that we have is that our resource table. So we want to connect the resource to the resource name. And then again, we have one-to-many single and then an active relationship. And then I'm going to click OK or save. And that completes our basic setup. Again, you can read more about the relationship and the setup in the tutorial here. So you see we have a data model that looks like that. And with that, we are ready to start building or start introducing our first DAX measures. We will use the first set of measures to create the first 3 pages of the dashboard that I showed you before. So namely, this will be the overview of the costs, revenues, and the hours of our project. Also, another page, which is the resources and cash flow that shows the breakdown of all the hours and then the costs and revenues over time. And then finally, a project plan, which is just a Gantt chart that shows the plan project timeline over time by different phases and then by different activities. As I did it previously with the DAX tables, I won't be typing in all the measures, but rather I'll be using my web tutorial here to copy and paste those measures directly into the Power BI dashboard. That way we can save a bit of time. Again, you can find a link to this tutorial at the description of this video. Before creating the first measure, I want to create a new table that we'll call a measures table. And that's something that's going to allow us to keep ourselves a bit organized. Okay, so let me go back to our practice sheet. And while I'm on the report view, you can see that there was the icon called enter data. I'm going to click on that. And you should see a window called create table. Now in the name, I'm going to type in measures table as the name and then click load. Okay, and after a few seconds, you should see a measures table appearing to your right. There it is over here. And then the idea is that we can use this measure table to store our future measures. Okay, so if I want to add a new measure, I can just right click on this table and then click new measure. You should see a measure name appearing in our bar. So this is very similar to what we did with our DAX dimensions. And then let's go back again to my tutorial, and I'm going to copy and paste the first measure. This measure is called unit rate. And what this unit rate does, it actually selects the appropriate rate, whether it's at hourly rate or a unit cost. We're using here that switch function, which decides on which table to look at. Okay, so if it's a labor, it's going to look into labor rates, and if it's a material, it's going to look into material costs. So I'm going to copy it, and then I'll go back to my practice sheet in here, and then I'm going to simply paste this measure and then click on that tick box or commit. And again, after a few moments, you should see our measure in our measures table. Here is the unit rate. Okay, the last thing I want to do, I want to take that column 1 and I want to delete it from the model. So you see when I do that, our measures table here move to the top, and then you see that icon slightly changed here, so it indicates it actually stores the measures or calculations in this table. Okay, so we have our first measure, and then the last thing I want to do is actually I want to put that measure into a subfolder. What we want to do now, we want to click on that unit rate and then go to a model view, and then if we open this properties pane, you should see there is a display folder field. So if I type in base and then enter, you should see that now that unit rate sits within that base folder. Okay, so there's just another level of organization within our measures table. And then in order for me to create or add another measure, I can now actually right click, not on the measures table, but actually on the name of that folder. So we'll actually put that measure within that folder itself. Okay. And then I can go back to my tutorial here. So we had a unit rate, and now we have resource cost. And what this resource cost does, it basically iterates over different resources in our project resources table and takes the quantity, and then it multiplies that by appropriate unit rate, and that unit rate here is the measure that we created before. Okay, so I'm just going to again copy that measure, go back to my practice sheet, we've already right-click on the folder this time and then add new measure. And then now I can paste this measure in, and then you'll see that once I've approved that measure, you see we have that resource cost. Okay, now we can go back to our tutorial, and you see we have the basic measures, and we can actually create a few more measures that will be now based on that resource cost. So you see there's a dependencies between those measures that we're building here. I want to create a measure that simply will show me cost just for the labor. So what this measure does here using the calculate, it uses that resource cost measure, which was summing up all the quantity and multiplying them by unit rate to get the costs. So it goes to that resource cost measure, but then it applies a filter on the resource type column just for the labor. So again, I've copied it and go back to my practice sheet and then click new measure. So right click on the base, new measure, paste it in. Okay, I have my labor cost added. Now we can go back to the tutorial and let's go to the similar measure, but this time, so it's a very similar measure to what we had with our labor cost, but now the filter changes from labor to a material. Right click on that base folder, new measure. So we have our material cost, and then just to complete our cost, the basic cost calculations, I'll just have the total cost measure, which simply is the addition of labor cost plus the material cost. Okay, so you see how we sort of start building the dependencies between those different measures, and each of the measures a building block that comes eventually to the total. With those 5 measures in place, we can actually start creating our first visual. And I'm going to create that card new, and this allows me to add some cards to my visual here. So I can add data, and then for my data, I want to go to show labor cost. So you see here, we can add material, and then we can add a total cost. Okay, so that's the basis of our visuals. Let's just expand it a little bit. Slightly change the formatting. We won't be doing too much formatting here, just to show you how those measures work. And then we see that, okay, well, one thing that we can do, which I sort of mentioned where we're looking to transform data, Power Query editor early on, I did mention that we could already change the formatting of some of the columns to currencies, but we can do it here on the level of DAX measure. So if I go to, for example, labor cost, I can change this currency to dollar. And then maybe we want to limit the number of decimal points to 2. And that gives you your first visual. So that gives you a breakdown of the cost between labor, material, and the total. So going back to my dashboard, you can see that in my overview page, I'm using exactly those first 3 cards. So the total cost, labor cost, and material cost. And then just looking at the settings of that visuals in here, you can see that I've also added a measure for project revenues. So that's the measure that I'm storing here. This measure simply takes the sum of all the payment amounts from my payment milestones table. And then also for the total hours, I'm using my labor hours measure. So there's a few more visuals here that I'm using. So for example, in this graph, I'm also showing the cost. So if we're actually adding up all those bars in here, we will get to the 7.85. But here I want to show the breakdown between the labor and material in a graphical form, broken down by project phases. And then the way that I set up these visuals is by adding the phase column from the dim phase table. So that's DAX table that we created at the beginning of the project. In addition to that, I'm using for the legend, I'm using that resource type column from our dim resource table. So again, that was one of the DAX dimensions that we created earlier. Okay, and then below that, I have another graph, and this time this graph is here, the tree map. So this just allows me to visualize how our staffing hours requirement look like. Okay, so namely, what sort of roles we need for that project, and then how many hours each of the role requires. And by using those squares here that trim up, I can quickly see sort of what are the proportions of those requirements compared to overall number of hours. Okay, so again, if we were to add all those numbers here, this will come to 20,000 hours. But what I want to do, in the detail, I want to again use the resource column from that dim resource DAX dimensions that we created. And then for my values, I want to use that labor hours measure, which is exactly the same measure as we're using in my total hours chart above. And then we're now getting into those material costs and the labor cost matrices. So let's go back to my web tutorial here. We're on the step 3C, but let's go to my first measure here, which is that time-phased cost measure, okay? Task of this measure is to take a resource with a specific calculated cost, and then in this case, spread those costs over time. Okay, so we know the total cost. We know the total cost for a specific resource that we need for a specific activity, but we want to now spread those costs across time. So going back to my matrix in here, I can now create the table or a matrix with a resource coming from that dim resource DAX table that we created in my rows. In the columns, I'm using the calendar's year. And then as the values, I'm using that time-based cost measure that we've just looked at, okay? And we'll do the same thing for labor. So you see that actually the setup of the matrix here for the labor cost is exactly the same. The one difference is that I'm applying also filters for those matrices. So for example, for the matrix that shows the labor cost, I have to make sure that I'm added a filter here for the resource type, and I'm only showing the labor for this matrix. And for that table over here, I'm only showing material as my resource type. Now, in order to create this resources and cash flow page, we need to introduce a few more measures. So let's go back to my tutorial here. You see that, okay, I'm introducing here the time phase quantity. So previously we have a time phase cost. Now I'm using the time phase quantity measure. The logic is exactly the same as what we did with our time phase cost, but this time we want to allocate the units, so whether those are hours or the units of material required for a given resource by a given activity. And again, I'm using my project plan. I know when the activity starts, when it ends. That allows me to calculate the duration for each activity, which then allows me to allocate those resource requirement on a daily basis. And then eventually by using that SUMX function here, I can sum it together depending on the calendar context. So for example, in here, if we go back to my resources and cash flow page, you see that here I want to show the staffing hours requirement, but this time I want to show it on a yearly and monthly basis. So previously on the previous page, we were showing everything on the yearly basis. Now I want to actually break it down into months. If we actually go to the setup of the metrics, you see that I'm using in my columns year and the month start, and then I'm using that time phase labor hours. For my rows, I'm using the resource name, and then as my values, I'm using here the time phase labor hours measure. So that's a measure that I'm introducing in the next step of my tutorial here, but it's basically, you will see here is the time phase labor hours measure. And what this measure does, using that calculate function, it takes that time phase quantity base measure that we've just introduced, and then it just applies a filter so it only shows the resource type for labor. But effectively, that allows me to display the breakdown of the hours that are required for each of the role over time on a monthly basis. Okay, you will see that in this matrix itself, I'm using a different shading for those hours, so that allows me to highlight the when I need most hours and when I need the least. And to do that, I had to go to the format pane, go on the cell elements in here, and then apply to my time phase labor that background color conditional formatting. Okay, so if I click on that FX icon, you'll see that I'm using a gradient as my format style, and that for the minimum value, I'm using white. For the maximum value, I'm using that blue in here. And then the effect is that you will see all the values, the high values displayed in this dark blue. And as we go into the lowest value, this blue will be lighter, eventually going to white when there was a 0 and there was a null value. Continuing with my measures here, you see that I'm also using that revenue measure. And then I have a time phase labor cost. So this measure uses this time phase cost base. And again, I'm applying the labor as my filter to that resource type column. Now, in addition to that, I've also introduced cash flow measures here. So in this case, I'm just simply saying that the labor cash flow is a negative time phase labor cost. We're showing the cost as a positive number. So you want to show the cash flow effect, we have to make it negative. And the material CF, so cash flow again, that also makes that time phase material cost negative. Then from the revenue cash flow, for revenue cash flow, I'm using that revenue measure. And then eventually to calculate the total cash flow, I have to take the revenues and add labor cash flow and then material cash flow. I'm adding because those measures are negative. So adding a negative number will have a negative effect on the cash flow. And then finally, I need to here use a cash balance measure. So that's a cumulative cash flow. Effectively, what it does, it just sums up all the cash flow over time. So this is the measure that we'll use in this project cash flow forecast matrix here. Okay, so you see that the setup here, again, the year and the quarter will come from that calendar table that we created at the beginning. And then you see that revenue, labor cash flow, material cash flows, and then the balance is exactly that cash flow balance measure that we just looked at. You see that I have to add a few more measures here or dimensions so I can create this matrix. So first of all, I had to create this dim CF categories table. This allows me to create a table with the name of the categories. And then I also wanted to create that CF value measure here. So what this measure allows me to do, it looks at the category that we're using in a given time. So for example, if we go back to that measure, you see those are the categories in my rows. And in the context of the category, I want to display a relevant measure. I also wanted to visualize this table, the project cash flow table in here. So I chose from the visuals this line and stack column chart. So I'm using the labor and material cost for my bar. And then as a line, I'm showing that cash balance here. So you see that there was a deficit in the early months of the project. And then we start having some surplus later on. Lastly, before we jump into our scenario planning, let's look at that project plan page. So if I go back to my dashboard and we click here, you see that I have this Gantt chart broken down by phases, project phases, activities, and shown on the yearly, quarterly, and then monthly level. So the basis of this chart, and it's actually just the standard Power BI matrix in here, is my isActive month measure here. Okay, so all this measure does, it basically again goes through my project plan for different activities, and then for each of those activities, it again extracts the start date, the end date, and eventually at the end, it just returns one if this activity is taking place in a given time period, or blank if it doesn't. Okay, so if we go back to my matrix here, let's look at that from the setup perspective. So again, we have our phase and activity name in the rows, year, quarter, month start in the columns, and then you see as a value, I have this isActive month measure. Okay, now let's go to our format pane and back to the cell elements. And then you see that I have two conditional formatting applied to the background color and the font color. Okay, so if I just turn off those formattings, you'll see that now I have ones and blanks in my matrix. Okay, which is the result of that measure that we just created. And now all we have to do is we just need to convert those ones into some visual representation. So that's exactly what that conditional formatting in the cell elements does. So if I turn on the background color formatting, and then I click on that FX column in here, I just have to change the format style to rules. And then if I just say, okay, if is active month, if the value is 1, and then let's make sure that we select number here, then I want to display that blue over here. Okay, and you see that now we have those bars in blue. And then the last thing, we still can see those ones in here. So we want to make sure that the font color also follows the same rule. So I'm going to switch it on and just want to make sure that we apply the same rules as my style. So I want to make sure also that if the value of my measure, which is that is active measure here, is 1, then also I want to select exactly the same blue as I selected for my background color. And then that's pretty much it. Okay, so that converts this matrix, this Power BI matrix, into our Gantt chart and project timeline. Now we are moving to our step 7 here, which is that scenario planning and sensitivity analysis. So let's go back to our dashboard and look at that page a bit closer. Okay, so what you will see on the top of the page here are those 5 slicers. Okay, and each of the slicer has a slider inside and is responsible for setting the delay percentage, material inflation percentage, labor inflation percentage, labor inefficiency, and then a payment delay. Okay, let me give you first a very quick overview of what's the purpose of the slicers, and then I'll show you how to create a parameter like that, and then we can go into the measures themselves and then see how they're being used in this matrix and the graph that you see below. First of all, let me show you how to create a parameter like, for example, that delay percentage. I'm going to go to my practice sheet here and go to modeling tab, and then I'm going to click on that new parameter and then choose the numeric range. Okay, this will open up this parameters window. I want to stay with my numerical range, and let's say this is my practice sheet, so I can just repeat the same name for the parameter. For the data type, I want to select the decimal number because it's going to be a percentage, so decimal. For my minimum, let's say I'm going to select -1 and 1. Effectively, that's -100% and 100%. So I want to create some limit on my minimum and maximum values. For the increment, I'm going to select 0.01, so I can change that parameter by 1%. And then as a default value, I'm going to set that at 0. Effectively, that means that if there's no parameter or there's no selection, there was a 0% delay, so there's no change to my base. Okay, I'm going to uncheck this add slicer to this page box because I want to actually show you how to add this parameter as a visual or as a slicer separately. Okay, so what you should see here to my right is a new table, and that's called delay percentage. And this table has here this delay percentage measure, which effectively generates a table with a series of values between -1 and 1 with an increment of 0.01. So now if I want to add this parameter to our visuals, I have to go to Insert. Then from my visuals, I'm going to select a slicer in here. And from the slicer, I'm going to add my delay parameter. It allows me to change those values by the increment of 0.01. The one thing I want to do, again, I want to click on this delay parameter here, percentage parameter, and I want to change that formatting to percentages. Now, if we go back to my dashboard here, you see that I've added the slicer that we've just added, again with some formatting changes. Now, the next important step is to actually link those parameters or value of those parameters to our measures. Okay, so if we go to my tutorial And again, you can find the link to this tutorial in the description of the video. You'll see that if we just scroll down here, we went through, I've listed all the parameters that we are using. And then in this step, I want to create what I call a multipliers, okay, or the measures that will be connected to my parameters. And then starting with the delay, I created a measure that's delay multiplier, which simply is 1 plus that delay percentage value, so the value of the parameter. Okay, so if, for example, the delay is 10%, this multiplier will be 1.1. Okay, and then you see later on, I will use this multiplier to calculate those revised scenario measures. Okay, when you see this colorless and 0, that basically means that if there is no value selected, by default, you will add a 0. And then with those parameters and those multipliers in place, you can see that now I'm starting to look into creating those measures. I try to describe, again, the logic of each of the parameter and how they work and how they would influence the measures. But for example, let's take this adjusted activity duration measure first. Okay, so you see that first I have a set of measures that will give me my baseline. Okay, so I'm taking the activity. I want to get the activity start from my base. I want to take the activity end, also using my base assumption, so the original project plan. And that will allow me to calculate the activity duration, again, based on the original start date and end date. So that's when I'm using this date diff function. And then finally, I can just take this activity duration baseline and then multiply it by that delay multiplier. This, in effect, allows us to calculate the adjusted activity end date. And all this measure does here is that we take the start date from my base plan. So the activity start date doesn't change. But in order to calculate the end date, we want to add those adjusted date. Now with this adjusted end date, I can actually already create my new Gantt chart. So I can modify my isActive measure that I've used before to create our project plan. So what this measure will do, it will basically look at the original start date, we'll look at the original end date of given activity, we'll also look at the adjusted end date of the activity. And if at a given period, the activity falls within its original base timeline, the measure will return 1. If it falls within the adjusted extended timeline, the measure will return 2. And if it doesn't fall into either of them, it just simply returns blank, okay? So let me show you what that means in practice. If we go back to my dashboard here, and then we actually go to that revised timeline, you see that here I have my original blue, darker blue color, which indicates the original timeline for a project or for an activity. And then I have these lighter shades in here. So if you recall from earlier, where we're creating this project plan, I was applying conditional formatting to cells displaying 1 as the result of using this isActive month measure for my values. In here, you see that we have those shades, 2 shades, so dark blue and then the light blue. And if I click on matrix, and then if we go to our format pane and then the cell elements, you see that if I turn off the formatting here, I have 2 values here. It's either 1 or 2. And then the 1 indicates the original timeline. So that's actually when the activity started or ended according to this original plan that we had. And then 2 indicates the extension. And then for the conditional formatting, all I had to do, I just had to add one more rule. So if I go back to my conditional formatting for the background color, select the rules, stay on the isActive month scenario this time, and then change the value settings, I should get to the matrix the way you saw it earlier. So again, we change the number. Let's say for the original timeline, we want to stay with that darker blue. And then we want to add a new rule. So that's just the addition here, that if we have a 2 as the number, so that's our extension, then maybe keep like a lighter blue in here, okay? And you see that's exactly what happened here. So we can still see ones and twos because we haven't applied the conditional formatting to the font color. But you can see already that the background changes according to our conditional formatting. Okay, so let's switch our font color formatting. And again, I need to go to the rules. Staying on the is active mass scenario, that's fine. And then if value equals 1 number, then we want to match the color of our background. And then we want to add another rule, if equals to 2, and it's a number, then we want to add that lighter blue. Okay, just have to make sure it's exactly the same color. Okay, so that creates that revise timeline, which really shows how this project timeline extended compared to our original assumptions. Going back to our scenario planning, you see that we have this revised project cash flow. So let's go back to my tutorial here. And then you see here that I'm adding those time phase quantity measures, but this time for scenario. So as I mentioned earlier, for example, for the quantity itself, I'm going to be using in this measure two multipliers. One is a delay multiplier and one is this labor inefficiency multiplier. Okay, so we extend our timeline, we're adding more days to our project or to our activity. We need to add more hours to the project itself. And then also if we say that we miscalculated the number of hours required to complete a given activity, we also have to take this in consideration. So what this measure does, it first has to get those baseline dates, so the start date and end date, according to our original project plan. It has to recalculate the duration of the project, taking in consideration the delay parameters, which you have over here. And then finally at the end, I also have to adjust the quantities for my labor. So in other words, the number of hours that an activity will require due to that inefficiency multiplier. And then eventually we'll give you the total number of hours that we need to spread over that adjusted duration. So if we go back to that scenario planning, you can see that impact of those parameters. For example, here in this revised staffing hours requirement. So if I change that delay to, let's say, 50%, you will see that those number of hours change here as well. Now let's go back to my tutorial for more measures. So that was the quantity adjustment, or namely the hours adjustment. And now we also have to calculate how all those adjustments translate into costs. So in this case, again, as a base, we still use this time-phased cost measure. So it's a similar logic, but now we have to take in consideration, again, that delay and the inefficiency that we already dealt with before. But we also have to look into my inflation for labor and then inflation for the material. Okay. So again, I need to get activity start date, end date, adjust the duration for the activity based on my delay parameter. Then moving forward, I also have to adjust the rate, a unit rate. And then finally, I have to sum everything up, aggregate everything up, and then apply it to my timeline using those new daily costs. That, in effect, allows me to complete my scenario planning page. So if we look at the matrix here, in my rows, I still have my categories. So the setup is identical to what I have in my original resources and cash flow page. For my columns, I'm using year and quarter. Now, for my values here, I'm using this CF value scenario measure. So we're still using that switch statement to allocate appropriate value to a given category displayed here in our rows. Now, with those measures, I can also calculate some new scenario totals, and that effectively allows you to calculate the variances between the base and scenario measures. So if we go back to our dashboard here, you see that here I've created cost variance analysis, and the setup of this cluster bar chart is that on the y-axis, I put the faces from my dim phase. So I'm keeping a similar setup to what we have on our overview, but here for my x-axis, I want to show the base cost, which is my total cost taken from the original plan. Then I have my revised cost, which is the total cost from my scenarios. And then you see that the result of that are those two bars, okay? Now, one thing that I did is that I wanted also to display this variance here, but as a label for my chart. So in order to do it, I had to go to my format pane. And if you go to the data label here, you see that for the data labels, when I change the series to revised costs in that apply settings to option, I click on show for this series, so we're showing the labels. But then if I go to the value and extend it as a field, I'm using that total cost variance. Okay, so I actually don't want to show the value itself because I can see the absolute value just by looking at my axis here, but I actually want to be explicit and show what's the variance in cost on the different phases, okay? And then finally, if we just go to my cash flow impact analysis, you'll see that in this matrix, for my values, I want to show the base amount, which is that CF value measure, that I want to show my revised amount, which is that CF value scenario measure. Then for my variance here, I have a CF variance measure. So that's a measure here that simply takes the CF value scenario minus the CF value. And then I also have a variance percentage measure, which divides that CF variance value measure by my base value in order to show the percentage variance. And then finally here, I have my revised staffing hours matrix, which again shows on the resource level in the rows and the years in the column, my scenario now time phase labor hours measure. So this is that revised number of hours driven by the delay or this labor inefficiencies that I mentioned before. Now you will see here that I would encourage you to go to the step 8 and sort of I've suggested a few different scenarios that you can play with. You have here my suggested base case, which is that proof project plan, so that's the base. And then you have a few different scenarios, for example, like schedule slippage or schedule delay, labor efficiency, some other delays, and also payment timing, so that's that revenue delay. And you will see that here after the recap of our tutorial, you see that you can actually preview the dashboard, which will allow you to review this dashboard again and go to our scenario page here where you can actually play with those parameters here on the page. One important thing before we finish, because we are using here two scenario pages. So one is the scenario planning page with all the parameters and the main output, but we also have this revised timeline, which is dependent on that delay parameter here. Do make sure that you synchronize the slicers between those two pages, namely between the scenario planning and the revised timeline. And to do that, in Microsoft Power BI, if you look here, you see there was a sync slicers tab. And then if you click on that delay parameter here, just have to make sure that under that sync column, you tick the box next to the revised timeline. Okay, so that way, if you change any of the parameters here, that delay parameter here, this will also sync with the that revised timeline page. So that's an important thing to remember.
I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to download the dashboard or learn more about data analytics, follow the links in the description of this video, or if you have any questions, leave a comment below. To get in touch with me directly, go to my website at www.challengejp.com. Thank you very much.